Every time I post a video on my channel, I inevitably get questions about contrast paints because I use contrast paints in pretty much every project that I do, whether it's a tiny little infantry model all the way up to a Titan, it will get used somewhere. I think I have quite a lot of experience with them and I enjoy them to no end. I love contrast paints. I think they are the best thing to be added to our painting arsenal in the last 2 to 3 decades. Love them. Now, a lot of people do ask me a lot of questions. There seems to be a lot of information out there, a lot of contradictory information out there about the correct way to use a contrast paint or where it should be used or why it should be used and any of those bits and pieces. So what I've done in today's video is I've compiled my top 10 things to know about contrast paints. I'm answering a bunch of questions that have been put forward by the community. Hopefully by the end of this video, you will have a better understanding about contrast paints. You'll feel a bit more comfortable using them, where to use them, how to use them, colors, all that kind of stuff. So stick around, guys, and enjoy the video. So the answer to this question is time. It saves a huge amount of time when it comes to painting individual miniatures or armies or whatever. I actually did a video previously showcasing how much this actually affects the overall time of painting a miniature. I got 2 miniatures exactly the same, and what I did was I base coated one with contrast and one with normal acrylic paints, and then I went further and finished painting them off, and the time difference between painting the one contrast and the one with standard acrylics was staggering. If you multiply that across an entire army, 60-70 miniatures, you're talking about hours and hours and hours of time saved painting those models. And I don't know about you, but with me, my hobby is vast. I collect so many different armies. I'm always jumping from project to project. So if anything is going to speed up painting for me, I think it's super important to do. So yeah. Use contrast. Okay, the second question that I get asked a lot, or another comment that pops up a lot, is that it's not working for me, it's looking darker, it's not looking great, it doesn't work, so on and so forth. And often not, it's not funny, I did laugh there, but it's not fair on people who don't know. Sometimes you fall into that trap where you assume people know things and then they don't, and then they have a bad experience, and then it's just not fair. And that is the primer that you use before painting with contrast. To me, it seems like a very obvious thing, and that is that you must put down a light primer before you put on contrast. Contrast is a transparent paint. It means you can see through it. So some people unfortunately have made the mistake of getting a miniature, spraying it black, and then start to apply contrast expecting to get the same results as anyone who has sprayed it with a light color, and you're just not going to do that. The color is just going to be super dark to the point where it's still just going to look black. So you're going to have to remember to use a light primer. I've done an entire video on how I prime miniatures ready for contrast. I will link that down below as well. If I've got any videos I think will help each individual point, I will share them, but I promise you it makes an absolutely colossal difference. Make sure you're doing it over a light color, really light gray, beige kind of colors, or just a white. They all work great for contrast. Just be consistent across an army, because like I said, it is see-through. So if you get 10 models and you've got a white spray and you spray them white and you paint them up, and then the next squad from your army, you've run out of white but you still have a light gray and you think you can spray that, the colors will look completely different. You just got to be consistent with your primer across your entire army, bright colors, you'll have a great time, no problems. I tend to get asked quite a lot about things like fur and cloth and how to apply the right amount of contrast to those. So I have a Warrior of Chaos miniature here from Warhammer The Old World, and I'm going to crow across now and demonstrate that to you in a live video. Okay, so as we move across and try and layer up this, of course, beautiful cape, as you can see, I load up my brush with the red, Blood Angel red contrast. I make sure that I do have quite a lot held in the well of the brush. As you can see, it's basically like a blob of red paint. And this is what I usually use to apply onto the model. I have that much contrast. And when I pick an area like the cape and I start to apply it, quite a lot of contrast is going to come off. But then I'm just going to start pushing and moving that contrast into the right areas, sinking it down into the recesses and getting it in the places where I need it to go. I don't try and drag it around too much. Whenever I feel a little bit light, I go and I get another nice big blob off of the palette and apply that onto the cape. You're going to take your time. You are going to focus on this area as you're applying it to make sure there's no pooling in any of the recesses or creases, something we'll talk a little bit more about later. And you're going to continue this process until you get a nice smooth coat of paint all across that cape, getting a nice coverage And even before you go and layer it, before you do anything else, this is just going to give you a beautiful tabletop standard red cape. Something that I would be more than happy to leave a model with and play some games with. So if you were in a rush to get models painted for a tournament or anything like that, very simple. As you can see, I always make sure that I have quite a lot of contrast on my brush because I do not want to be dragging around half-dried paint or anything that's going to like tear or cause any weird kind of defects in the painting structure. A bit of brown contrast was then used for the fur. So once again, load up the brush so it's got a nice blob and then start to feed it between all of the kind of tufts of fur that exist across his back. You do not want to be stingy here and trying to get little bits of paint into all those nooks and crannies. You're going to be ending up with it being blotchy, or you're going to end up missing bits and there's going to be the screaming bits of white showing through on the fur. So less is literally more, or more is more. More is enough. Use more contrast. It's important. As I know how to stress that enough that if you use a little amount of contrast, you're not going to enjoy the process of using contrast. You will get better at controlling the amount that you know you need, and you'll get better at controlling the amount and not hitting other parts. So I've managed to hit the cape and the fur here. There's no red on the fur and there's no fur on the red. It both looks great. And it didn't take much time at all to do. Contrast paint is, of course, its own skill. So the more you practice, the more you use it, the better you're going to get, and the more you're going to understand quantities of paint to use. A lot of people are curious how I choose which paint I use to layer up after I've applied a contrast. And that is a very simple thing. As you know, a lot of paint ranges these days are based around a triad system. So the companies that produce the paints put them together in sets of 3. You've got a base paint, a layer paint, and a highlight paint. It's very simple. Even Games Workshop has their paints set up like this, although they don't really talk about it a lot, pretty much anywhere. But you can look up online a painting chart from Games Workshop and see the paints lined up like this. So in the example given here, you're supposed to use Mephiston Red, then you're supposed to layer it up with Evil Sunz Scarlet, and then finish it off with Wild Rider Red. I simply substitute the base paint in question with a contrast that works. So for instance, in this example, I started with Blood Angel's Red contrast, then I move over to Evil Sunz Scarlet, and then I highlight with Wild Rider Red. It's very simple. So all you need to do is find a match to the base paint that matches closely to your contrast paint, and then work up the triad from there. It's very, very simple. I do get asked a lot, do I thin my contrast paints down at all, or do I use a wet palette? And the answer is generally no. I especially don't use contrast with a wet palette, as I was told when contrasts were first released that they do not react well to water. They just don't, those two things do not get on together. It's why contrast came out originally with a contrast medium, and that's what you're supposed to use to thin down your contrast. And that's what you should be using to thin down your contrast. It's something that I do not do. I tend to use my contrast out of one of those rubber palettes. The reason that I use the rubber palettes for my contrast is because they have those little wells for holding the contrast together. Why it's important to hold contrast together is so it doesn't dry out at all. With any other normal acrylic paint, if you put it on the miniature and it's a little bit dry, it's fine. You can add a little bit more water to it and kind of glaze over it again or whatever. If you are applying contrast that is semi-dry to the model, you are just going to get torn paint, cracks, blotches, just not a very nice finish on your paint. So the fact that the contrast is kept together in a nice little kind of little cup or little bowl thing on those rubber palettes means that it stops it from drying out like that, and you get a much more usable amount of time with it. So it's great. Should you use contrast with tanks? Now, I have shown in videos previously that you can indeed choose to use contrast for tanks. In fact, this is my Black Templar's Sicaran, and I contrasted this tank up. There's a whole video on how I did it. That was just to prove the point that you could, if you so wished, contrast a tank. Do I personally use contrast on my big flat surfaces on tanks? No, not a lot. Honestly, I go with the stippling method that I used using the Artist Opus brushes, and I stipple away. I've done them on my Cadian tanks and a bunch of other tanks like that. I find that to be a much more forgiving technique. Contrast on tanks is doable, but it's not easy, and I don't think that it's a hell of a lot quicker than using generic acrylic paints. Can you use an airbrush with contrast paints? And the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, you can get really nice results contrasting up or airbrushing with contrast paint. There's a couple of things to keep in mind when you want to do it though. For instance, Traditionally, when someone is using an airbrush to airbrush miniatures, they have their PSI, which is the pressure of the air being pushed out through the nozzle of your airbrush, set to between 30 and 40 PSI. This pushes those thick, heavy-bodied acrylics through your airbrush out onto the miniature. Because contrast paints are so thin, you do not need nearly as much force to do it. In fact, if you add too much force, it is going to push the very viscous liquid onto the model and then push it outwards and create beading and all sorts of problems. That's not what you want. So you need to knock your pressure down to between 10 and 15 PSI and do nice smooth passes. Don't go over a section that is really wet again, or like I said, you will continue to push that paint around, creating all sorts of problems. Nice smooth pass, 15 to 10 PSI, contrast, airbrush, great. Okay, so what I take to mean by staining, when people ask this, is when the paint does not go on smoothly and it creates all sorts of blemishes and stuff across the surface of the miniature. What I kind of equate to the problem is that you are not using enough contrast at that time. So you have a small amount of contrast on your brush, which is causing it to begin drying, especially when you start scraping it across the miniature. I use the word scraping deliberately because if you are using a very small amount of contrast on a brush, contrast does dry quite fast. You apply it to a model, it is going to start tearing and just it's just not good. It is very difficult to repair this damage as well, and you can't just simply throw another coat of contrast over the top of it because the previous coat will have dried, and as we know, contrast dries waterproof, so the only way to repair it is to then go over with, acrylic paints, layering it and stuff like that, but you will not get the contrast look that you are looking for. So add a little bit more, wait for it to settle where it needs to go, and then remove any excess. How to avoid pooling. Now, pooling is something that is, of course, a big danger when it comes to contrast paint because of all the things we talked about before. It is quite a viscous paint. It runs down quite a lot. It's supposed to settle into all the recesses and cracks, but sometimes it can settle where you don't want it to, and that can cause big problems. So how do we stop this from happening? Well, honestly, it's about being diligent. If you put on too much contrast paint and then you kind of go away and start working on another part of a miniature, and then you kind of turn it back around 10-15 minutes later to the part you painted, and you've got horrible pooling, once again, like the staining thing, there's not really a lot you can do then. It has dried enough that if you try and scrape it off or try and paint it away, you're just going to create even a bigger mess. So it's about being diligent. When I paint with contrast paints, I do one section of a model at a time. So for instance, if I take a Space Marine, I will go from his hip joint down to his foot. And I will make sure that all those armor plates are covered in contrast in a nice neat fashion, and I will make sure before I move on to the next section that those paint has pooled down and I've removed any excess that's causing pooling. So you just have to focus on the miniature. Obviously use your head. If like in this example you've got a lot of paint on a flat shield, it is of course going to sink down to the bottom, so you can kind of guess where the pooling is going to start happening and you can stop it happening before that does. The final part, and that is sometimes it is okay to let contrast stand by itself. There is an entire style of painting based around this method called slap chop, where you literally apply the coat of speed paint, contrast, whatever you want it to be, onto the area, and that's it, it's done. You've done a little bit of work before you've applied the contrast to make sure it gives the the best effect it can, with some dry brushing from dark to bright. But for me, normally, sometimes on a model, a contrast just looks great. For example, on a miniature I painted last week, I did a great unclean one, a great big behemoth of a demon, and when I painted up his flesh, I applied plate bare flesh, then I went through a whole host of dry brushing to really make it stand out. When it came to his horns, I applied one coat of Agaros Dunes, and then I had the other two paints I was going to do for the layering and the highlighting. But before I did, I just really liked how it dried on the horns. I thought it looked fantastic, so I was happy enough to just leave it there. Sometimes it is okay to let contrast stand by itself. Okay guys, and there we have it, my top 10 tips for using contrast paint. Hopefully you guys have learned a little bit more about contrast paints from this video. It has answered some of your questions. It hasn't created a whole host more, I hope. If this video has done anything, it has encouraged you to go out and try these paints for yourself. I definitely believe they have their place in everybody's arsenal of painting for getting miniatures on the tabletop quickly, efficiently, and looking fairly nice. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you let me know by giving the video a like. Ask me any questions you want in the comments below. I'll get back to as many of them as I can. And make sure that you're subscribed to the channel. If you're not subscribed, you're making me sad. Do you want me to be sad? You really want a grown, bald man to be sad? What kind of a person are you? Subscribe. If you also want to help support the channel, there's things like becoming a YouTube channel member or checking out my Patreon linked below. Both of those two things get you an extra video every single week from me. So if you want to get even more content, make sure you check those out. Thank you guys so much for sticking around to the end of the video. I'll see you in the next one.